want to talk about as a part of the work groups, okay? And so one of the topics that I teed up was, or not I teed up, but Maggie. Maggie here, by the way? Maggie, hello, Maggie? She's not here, oh well. So she talked about 2FA and the usage of 2FA and the adoption of 2FA and how the use of 2FA and the different types of 2FA would be what's happening, you know, how people are using 2FA in different ways. And so I said, well, what would be really cool is to actually talk about it more in a broader context around when is 2FA actually appropriate, okay? And so that was one of the topics that I had teed up as a work group topic that we would discuss to give you a sense of what kind of output we would want to produce, okay? We don't want to produce a briefing because, well, briefings are nice, but people actually will, a paper will make more sense than just a briefing. So let me kind of quickly walk through this notion of what can we further develop in a particular concept, and I'll use the 2FA one as an example. So measuring privilege. When we think about privilege, we oftentimes think of it as you have privilege or you don't have privilege, okay? But I would argue privilege is more of a continuum. If you were to consider just an arbitrary scale from 0 to 100 of privilege, what you would say is the greater privilege you have, the greater impact that you have. And so you have this continuum that goes from 0 to 100, whatever that means, okay? Earlier I mentioned the GitHub example where you have GitHub read-only, all the way to corporate access to the corporate GitHub site, okay? And so there's this notion of privilege as a continuum. And what we do is we oftentimes try to put in controls that reduce the impact from the exploitation of that privilege, okay? And so somehow we introduce controls, and we want to be able to do it in a way that uses granular, very small incremental measurements. Unfortunately, most of the things that we do today is a step function. You either use or you don't use two-factor authentication. And as a result, you have this sort of, at some point, you have privilege, and then all of a sudden, at some point, now, we're going to try to reduce that risk. There is actually a formal definition, but it is, it is some, well, in the context of computer security, it's some right that you have to perform some action. Well, I jokingly put, you know, the title slide was intentional, but yeah, some sort of access that you have that other people do not have. Okay, so at the end of the day, though, we're trying to reduce the impact from misuse of that privilege, and so at some point we introduce some control. Okay, and as a result of the fact that we operate on a step function, we have these issues where if you look back to the original curve. Where we look at the risk associated with having privilege. Let me show you this again. So the dotted line, the solid line is the inherent risk from having some privilege. The dotted line is the residual risk after you implement some set of controls, like 2FA, okay? So if you compare that, though, with what is, I think, sort of like an ideal curve, then you have these disparities that appear. And these disparities appear in such a way where, in some cases, if you don't implement a control in time, you have a set of assumed risks. Okay? And if you implement a control too early, then you create burdens on the user. Okay? Let me state that again, because this is a key concept. The notion that if I don't implement a control for a given privilege in time, before if I implement it short of the nature of the impact that I might otherwise suffer, then I am actually assuming some amount of risk. If I implement it too early, then I'm going to create a burden on you. So I'll give you an example of GitHub. Okay, if I implemented some privilege control on the left side of the spectrum, so for read-only access, if I said you have to put in two-factor authentication to just read GitHub, GitHub would not even be a business today, right? If I implemented two-factor authentication or some control really too far to the right, okay, then we have additional exposure in the context of potential repos being compromised because it's for credential reuse or whatever else it might be. Okay, does that concept make sense? And so the basic idea is today we just have some arbitrary threshold at which point we say we now have to implement two-factor authentication. But can we come up with something that's even more granular, where at each stage of privilege we have a way to say, okay, what is some capability that enables us to exert some kind of control that operates at the necessary privilege level, and to do it across multiple, a much wider spectrum as opposed to just one, yes, you have 2FA, or you don't have 2FA. Now, within the context of the conversation that we had with Maggie yesterday, it could be, it can entirely be like SMS is here, whereas a security token is right here, okay? And so that could be one way to look at different forms of 2FA. But the question really is, can we look at privilege more as a continuum and less as a step function? And the more that we can ultimately come up with these options and a framework to understand those options, the more we can actually reduce either the burden that we create or the risk that we assume. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm giving you a template for how we want to think about the workshops and what type of conversation you want to have, and ultimately what sort of outputs we want to have. This is not, we don't want an output in the form of a briefing. We want an output in something that we can potentially publish or write up. Okay? Questions, thoughts, including on this? Okay. Well, that's what this, someone said this is cool. That's what this type of philosophy track is all about. Okay, this is half-baked, okay? There's a lot of opportunity for input and conversation, and like I have no idea. I really have no idea what these arrows actually are, okay? And like if you ask me where's 2FA, I don't know. I mean, is it here? Is it here? Is this 2FA and this is 3FA and this is 4FA, right? Maybe. I don't think it is, right? So we go from 1FA to 2FA, and is it truly just an integer jump? Is there something in between? We have to figure that out. For those who are familiar with my DAI briefing from last year, I showed this notion of a impact curve. And part of what I think one of the other ways to look at privilege is to say, what if I measure privilege based on the aggregate impact of a set of systems that I oversee? So the impact here is measured in uptime. It's a proxy for value of a system. So the longer lived some system is, the notion is I'm connoting more value to a system. So the longer lived, like for example in your body, your long-lived cells are probably more valuable than your short-lived cells. Okay, what are your short-lived cells? Your skin cells. What are your long-lived cells? Your brain cells. I'm pretty sure you would value your brain cells more so than your skin cells. So likewise, in the context of looking at systems and saying, what is the uptime of a system, we can see there's a curve that manifests that says there's a whole bunch of systems that are long-lived and there's a whole bunch of systems that are short-lived. Could you measure privilege based on just the uptime of a system? And then the aggregate then becomes a way to more granularly define what your impact is, okay? And saying, if I only have access to one cattle that's down here, then my impact is really only one little incremental bump up here. If I happen to access these two systems on the far left that have, if you look at the graph, accumulated uptime of 15,000 days, then that's probably pretty high up there on the spectrum. But likewise, if I have access to 8,000 short-lived systems, that might be the equivalent, okay, or at least maybe half yeah, it might be equivalent to the 15,000 days that are encompassed in those two systems up there. So again, think about different ways that we can measure more granularly so that we can then end up with a curve that looks more like the line and less like the step function. Okay? All right. Hopefully I bought us enough time for lunch. Since I don't hear noise over there, I'm assuming lunch isn't there. But we will now break for lunch. In the intervening time, please look through the philosophy track CFP, look at the different workshops, and please join one of them, because this is the kind of conversation that we want to have, and we want you to contribute to them, okay? We want you to be part of the conversation and to be able to be co-authors in the creation of these things. So with that, thanks very much. We'll see you in about 45 minutes.